Welcome to Tangent Proptech, where real estate meets innovation and goes a bit off script. I'm Edward Cohen, Proptech entrepreneur and your host, alongside my co-host and Proptech venture capitalist Zach Ahrens. On this show, we bring on a guest who's shaping the future of real estate. If you work in PropTech development, or if you're just obsessed with making buildings and cities better, this show is for you. And of course, we go on some tangents. Welcome to Tangent. I'm Edward Cohen.
I'm Zach Ahrens, big hair and all. Welcome to Tangent.
Also known as Owning Manhattangent.
That's good. Do you know where the word Manhattan comes from? I'm sure you do.
From what I understand, it comes from Manhattan, which means hilly island.
That is correct. The language is Algonquin. The people are Lenape. Super impressed with your knowledge of the beloved city behind you, and also lots of respect for you as an immigrant to our fair city as well.
Appreciate it. I prepare every morning in case these questions come up. Anyway, today on Tangent, we have Brian Turner, CEO of OTI. Hi, Brian. Where does this podcast find you?
Hello. I am currently in the East Bay in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Great place to be for innovation. Let's jump into it. But first, what is OTI?
OTI is a system integrator primarily focused on operational technology systems within buildings. Most of the buildings we work in are office buildings or large retail shopping centers, hospitals, medical office buildings, mostly buildings that are designed to house and provide space for humans.
You've been at this for some time now, meaning you've seen how the space has evolved, both in how the operators of buildings think about retrofitting their buildings or improving what goes on in their buildings, but also the devices and the services that we can include in buildings these days. So walk us through, how that evolution until today in terms of when you started with OTI and where you are now.
I began my career in the mid-90s, just after college in this industry. So I've been at it for just about 30 years. And I would say 30 years ago, to have any kind of advanced automation was really a luxury. And certainly energy was a topic. People wanted to control how much energy they used, how much energy spend they had. But I would say that it wasn't necessarily the most important thing. I would say as long as I've been in this career, people have wanted buildings to be able to provide comfortable spaces, whether it's a classroom environment for K through 12 or a university, or an office environment for office employees, or a hospital, right? We've always wanted to keep things comfortable. But as we've evolved and figured out what real comfort is, it's not just temperature, it's humidity, it's CO2, it's other gas emissions that might make their ways into spaces, or it's even contaminants that will come off the paint or out of the carpet. So there's just so much more focus on what a healthy and sustainable building looks like. And then, of course, the last decade, we've really seen a shift into energy efficiency as we've seen rising energy costs and overall system age. As it becomes older and they become less efficient, we start to see lots of focus and attention on not just building new fancy sky rises, but also how do we take care of our legacy building stock.
Every time I see a building advertised in New York and they say pre-war, I'm always wondering which war they're referring to, because we have some really old buildings here and it really depends. Now, you recently wrote that for every new skyscraper, there are 1,500 existing buildings untouched. Tell us about the real opportunities in retrofits. And I mean, you touched on like energy efficiency, and we know a lot of these has come from quote unquote incentives or sticks from regulation, not necessarily about the goodwill of certain players, but normally that's how incentives are driven when prioritizing what renovations to do. But tell us about the real opportunity in retrofits when it comes to energy optimization, risk mitigation, and all these themes that we hear about when it comes to improving building operations.
Yeah, sure. It's such a broad topic. You look at the photo behind Zach there and all the buildings behind him, probably one or two of them have any kind of advanced automation in them. Most of them are maybe even still dealing with old radiators that have been in there for 60 or 70 years, and they might be leaking by all the time. My daughter lives in New York, and the only time her radiator ever gets shut off is when the building shuts it off for the summer. So she has no control of it. There's a lot of waste. They keep their windows open just to keep it manageable inside. And that's just one example of a very real problem all throughout the Midwest, the Northeast. This isn't something that we've addressed as a country to really take care of our aging building stock. When you look at the newest buildings, they're beautiful, they're fantastic. They go up LEED certified. Another one of my articles, I think I wrote that most of the LEED certified buildings don't perform like they did on day one after 3 years, right? They're less efficient. There's even studies out there that say that they're less efficient than non-LEED certified buildings in a lot of cases. And I think that goes to the ambition of the developer and of the builder to make it as energy efficient as possible. But too often our builders and our developers are not our operators. And if the operators are not motivated by the same incentives that the builders were, you end up just with a building that's not working as designed. And I think that's unfortunately more the status quo than it is the outlier.
Totally. This conversation is reminding me of one of our previous friends of the pod and also Metaprop company, Kelvin, that provide radiator covers to enable residents to control the actual temperature inside their apartments. But Zach, what are you seeing in this space? I mean, we know it's evolved so much, and again, a lot of it is driven by regulation. In New York, we have Local Law 97 that went into effect last year, and buildings are still wrapping their head around how to best approach it. We've seen a couple of players in the space, such as Parity and Runwise, really take charge, at least here locally in New York City and regionally, helping buildings be more efficient when it comes to their energy usage. But how do you think about when you vet opportunities out there, companies, tech companies that are providing hardware, providing software, empowering the operation teams to maybe spend less energy or to more efficiently address issues around energy? How do you see this space?
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of risk. There are the risks with investing in software for energy management and reduction is it's unclear what kind of leverage that can get you within the asset itself. Like, how is this software integrating with the existing systems? Or I think one of the points Brian was alluding to, are there even any systems in this building where you can actually control certain levers to reduce your energy? Also, as an investor, if you want to invest in hardware, that comes with its own set of risks. We have uncertain, to say the least, tariff regime associated with manufacturing a lot of these devices that can either sit on top of or alongside existing heating and cooling infrastructure or can integrate in some way with the core building management system that has theoretically more defensibility, but also has quite a bit more risk associated with what can go wrong. Investing into full-blown systems or platforms similar to what the large incumbents have now been creating for decades, your Siemens, Schneider Electric, your Honeywell, your Johnson Controls systems, there's certainly opportunity there. Again, additional complexity, even more additional complexity than hardware device. Theoretically, though, more of a technical moat. A lot of the problems with adoption, also echoing what Brian was saying, a lot of buildings don't have these systems. which is theoretically a good thing. You're coming in and you're selling a system that will both increase tenant comfort and satisfaction and reduce energy when one doesn't really exist. But the person managing that building doesn't necessarily have the incentives to adopt it or to adopt it quickly. And then if you sell into the existing enterprise category, you're dealing with a rip and replace, right? It's selling to a specific person. They have relationships with whomever's been selling them the Johnson control system or the Honeywell system for the last 5 buildings they've worked on together. What is their incentive to switch, even if it theoretically is better and cheaper? So traditionally been a challenging category. Perhaps the most important thing we can do to existing building infrastructure to really make a dent, right? If you can cut energy usage by 20% across the board, I mean, that would be tremendous.
So, Brian, you started as a controls contractor, HVAC, meters, automation, and then you moved into enterprise integration. So, what did you see that made you realize buildings don't just need new equipment, they need a unified brain?
Yeah, when I was installing control systems, you start off as a technician and your view of the building is the VAV controller, the air handler controller, maybe the central plant. And you're looking at all of these things very much in a silo, right? When you're focused on making sure the plant works, you're thinking of the plant as a system. And as you move up through the career, you start looking at maybe the building as a system of systems, right? And so you're starting to look at the impact and the interaction of all of these different systems, but we're still very focused on mechanical systems. Weren't focused at all on the metering or on the electrical side, or even what kind of impact the coffee maker could make or the copy machine could make on the indoor environment, right? And as you keep moving up the chain and then you start looking, I moved in my career away from technician and more into sales and project management. And you start seeing how the chief engineers were using their data. And you found out really they're not using their data. The engineers would say that every point, control point or system point would be trended. And so we would have, back in the early days, 15-minute interval data. We would have that stuck on a computer underneath the chief engineer's desk, never to be used again. You'd have alarms that would trigger everywhere, never to be looked at because they would just get alarm fatigue. I'm talking late 90s, early 2000s. Alarm fatigue was already something. It's not just something that we have today. And so it just dawned on me that without taking a much broader approach, backing out a lot more and looking at all of the way buildings are operated across the different types of buildings, looking at all of the data that's being collected, and if we don't use that data, we'll never actually make any impact anywhere. Because I could go to one building and make it very energy efficient, and it will only be energy efficient as long as I continue to go there and make sure it stays energy efficient, or if somebody's there who really cares about energy efficiency. And there's anecdotal evidence that's happened for the last 30 or 40 years. You can always find that one chief engineer in that one New York building that made his building a standout from an energy perspective. But even within the same portfolio of buildings, to try to find 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 engineers that ran their buildings the same way, it's just not probable. And so that's where I started looking at, you not just had to connect the enterprise, but you had to get all that data into an enterprise application that could actually look at the data holistically and start to really understand where commonalities exist, where opportunities exist. And then, of course, once you can see that whole picture, then it gives you a much better idea where you can target. Because you might have an idea that the building that gets the most tenant complaints is also the least energy efficient. That may be true, but it's also equally probable it's not true. And so there's so many things you can do with the data. And ultimately, that's why we went into software, because we found out that just collecting the data and then trying to mine that data with humans was not feasible either, that you actually had to have machines acting on the data and finding the problems for you.
Walk us through one or two examples, like specifically of an office building or a university or a hospital that, how how do you engage them? What's like the issue that gets you in the door that they need OTI for? And how do you go about just improving, revamping how they handle energy efficiency or any other pain point that you help them solve?
Yeah, so really it's about exploration and just being curious and having a conversation with people. Most people, when you just engage with them as people, they will tell you where they're struggling. And I think that's the big differentiator between when I say we're a master system integrator today. Our goal is not to integrate every single system for the sake of integrating every single system. Our goal is to figure out where those pain points are. Do you have a problem with service or maintenance? Do you have this problem with, you hear a lot of times about aging workforce. My aging workforce is about to be gone and I've got these new employees coming in, they don't know what to do. And so then you start the conversation, okay, what do you think would make those new employees effective in your organization? They don't have 40 years of experience. They're not going to get it. You can't plug a USB drive and just load it all into them. So what kinds of things do they look like? We talk a lot about when we engage with clients, we engage with a roadmap. And we use a simple example. It's like when you decide that you want to go somewhere, you're not quite sure how to get there, or you don't know the best way, you put it into Waze or Google Maps or somewhere, you're going to put in your address that you're trying to get to. And then that's going to route you in the most effective ways. And you can even tell it, hey, I don't want to go on freeways, or I want to avoid toll roads, or whatever you want to avoid. And then while you're on your way, it'll even reroute you if there's an accident or something that's going to change. So those things are all great. But you have to think about just about everything in life, but especially when you're looking at your journey on how you're going to get to a more efficient building and more comfortable building, you know where you want to go. So we look at three different things, and not everyone even knows what to answer when I ask them those kinds of questions. So we'll give them three categories and say, are you going to prioritize human comfort? Are you going to prioritize energy efficiency? Or do you want to prioritize equipment lifecycle, for example? Those could be three. They're very different things. Ideally, if you're doing one of them, they're going to have positive impacts on the other two, but you got to figure out which one you're going to prioritize. And then you start to really drill into where their pain's coming from. Because if they're like, man, I've got to stop spending so much capital on capital equipment every year, we're not getting the life cycle out of our equipment that we're expecting. Instead of an air handler lasting 15 years or 20 years, it's lasting 8, and then I'm having to replace it. Or my cooling towers are dying after 3 years every single time. I have no idea what's going on. So then we start to find, okay, there's your pain point, and that's what we're going to start to address. And does that mean I have to integrate lighting? Absolutely not. Does it mean I have to go put in gas detection? No. We're going to focus on that problem right there. And it's really just the start of the journey, and then you build. And the more trust, and I think our approach is as a partner, not as a project company. So we're not there to execute a project, get through warranty, and leave you in the dust. We're there to help you along this roadmap the whole time. And we're there to help you pivot when something happens and you need to reroute. You have to understand how you're going to reroute and also how you're going to get back onto the road that you were heading on, even though you have to reroute a little bit. And so that's a big part of our model and a big part of how we approach customers. So I would say every single customer is going to have a little different outcome that they're looking for and a little different journey that they're going to take to get there. But ultimately, all three of those things end up being positively impacted.
In terms of the external factors impacting the industry or the prioritization of these decisions, would you say that the impetus to have these conversations come from regulation, if there is one in the place, or comes from the fact that interest rates are higher than they were before, so you need to look into deeply into operation costs, and with HVAC typically being the largest energy consumer in the building, yeah, what's the impetus to really prioritize these type of conversations? And also within the three outcomes to optimize for that you just mentioned, tenant experience, energy efficiency, and equipment life cycle, have you noticed that like certain commercial real estate asset classes will prioritize one over the other? Like hospitals may have equipment that is a lot more expensive than your office building, so maybe they prioritize, but they also have patients, so maybe tenant experiences, even if you can call a patient a tenant. But anyway, yeah, have you noticed that like different real estate asset classes prioritize one of the three over the others?
It's funny. So I use the word occupant rather than tenant because, yeah, I want to be able to include all of those different use cases. And I use comfort instead of experience because to me, experience involves a lot of different things that have nothing to do with energy savings. The tenant experience, as you typically will hear, is about how easy was it for a visitor to get in through a lobby and into the space that they were visiting that building? Or did they have a Uber service on their tenant app? Those things are, I'll say sexy, but they don't have any real impact on the type of stuff we're trying to impact. So when we look at occupant comfort, that one actually, when you really start digging into it, it starts to become a really important thing for almost all of those asset classes, especially if you're in a hospital. They want to make sure that those patients are comfortable. There's a lot of studies out there that patients who are comfortable and generally happy also heal better. Hospitals want people healing. They don't
Wow.
want people getting sicker. So the better you can make their indoor environment, the better you're going to be able to get patients out and get them back into a healthy space. When you're in an office building, there's lots of studies that show that people who are comfortable, who have the right CO2 levels, the right indoor temperature and humidity, are also more effective at their work. Same thing with students, right? So there's a lot of reason, both real and I'll just say subjective, that have been studied that make it really nice to have good indoor comfort. Also, if you guys are in New York, my daughter's in New York. She lives in, I don't know, 80 square feet or something. She doesn't want to work from home, right? She wants to go out, be in an office, be in a comfortable office, and be around people and interact with people. But she wouldn't want to do that if the building that she went to was less comfortable, hotter, colder, not friendly at all in the environment. She wouldn't want to be there. She would stay home. But instead, she works in a nice office building in Midtown, and they have good indoor comfort, and she enjoys being there. And the same thing, she goes to school, same thing. Her school has good indoor comfort. She enjoys being there. So that's an important thing across all asset classes. The real question is, will they prioritize it? Because right now there's no like incentives or hammers that say if you don't provide good indoor comfort, then you're gonna have to pay fines. The only time you get that is like what we saw a couple decades ago with sick building syndromes, and you were getting people that were saying because of the mold in my building I got sick, and they would get sued. But that was still a pretty small percent of the population that was happening. But the energy efficiency, the energy intensity of buildings, that's where we really started to see in the Northeast and a little bit out west, the more of the regulation type stuff. And Local Law 97, I think, has taken it to another level. And it'll be really interesting when the fines start to have a meaningful impact on the OpEx of these building owners, because right now I think they're just a little slap in the wrist compared to the overall value of these organizations. And so I still don't think we're seeing the massive impact that we thought Local Law 97 would have had when it was released 3 or 4 years ago. And so I think that's an interesting one. The equipment side has actually been, I would say, a lesser problem for most. Where we see the equipment life cycle actually climb up the ladder is really in coastal regions where there's a lot of salt deterioration on rooftop equipment. And they're looking at, hey, is there anything we can do chemically? Is there anything we can do? What can we do, period, to get 8 to 10 years out of this equipment that's supposed to last 15 if it was in a more friendly climate, but we're only getting 3. So how do we get closer to a normal expectation there? And so then it is things like, yeah, we can do better treatments, we can do better cleanings, we can do lots of different things. So it's about more finding out the triggers on maintenance to do that. It's just different for every owner type that you're talking about and where they're located on which one of those is going to be really high priority. But I would say that human comfort and energy efficiency are always a topic for every single client. And then it's a matter of, do you have to prioritize one all the time? And the answer to that question is no. There are certain times where you should have a system that's capable of switching those priorities based on ambient conditions, current conditions, right? And so I think that's the exciting part of where we're going over the next decade. It's not just about having individual building systems, but also having all of this other data that's now becoming available to us in such real-time ways that we're going to be able to have meaningful impact that's going to be real-time and sustainable over time. Unfortunately, it still means we're only able to impact the top 15% of buildings. This is still a luxury item, and we still have 85% of the building stock that we got to do something with.
The future of real estate comes together again next September at Blueprint in Las Vegas. You'll join more than 900 Build World executives and over 850 startups and investors who are shaping how the industry works from construction to transaction. With trillions of dollars in assets represented and some of the world's best innovators under one roof, this is where the future of the built world takes shape. Blueprint 2026 will be held at the Venetian Las Vegas from September 22nd to 24th. Tangent listeners can save $300 on an all-access pass by visiting blueprintvegas.com/tangent. That's blueprintvegas.com/tangent for $300 off your Blueprint all-access pass. A lot to unpack there. For those who aren't up to speed with Local Law 97 here in New York City, it was part of the Climate Mobilization Act, which mandates buildings with over 25,000 square feet to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. Zach, just curious from the LP side or with your developer operator of buildings hat, what drives building owners and operators to look at deeply in how the energy is being consumed and spent in their buildings? And is there a point, like whether it is when they're just acquired a new building, when is it that they prioritize energy efficiency and how it impacts tenant control and how it impacts the lifespan of equipment? Is there like a more common moment in time where they should, or is it come down to there's a new law, what's the fine, maybe let's prioritize this now? Or when does this become a top priority for owners and operators?
In the context of buying an existing asset or building something ground up, or
Yeah, for existing buildings, let's say if they've owned a building for a while, how does this become all of a sudden a priority? Or if they buy a new building, is that a moment where, okay, we're buying this new building, let's already take advantage of the momentum and consider improving, upgrading the energy efficiency in the building?
There are a handful of factors that can serve as the ultimate impetus. I think if you look at Empire State Realty Trust, they didn't see COVID on the wall necessarily, but they saw the writing on the wall that their particular portfolio in the future might be considered less desirable for large corporate tenants because it was in older building stock. And you know which war they talk about, Edward. It's not the American Revolution. But if you look at that REIT, the vast majority of the assets they own, obviously they're known for owning the Empire State Building, right? That's a early between 1929 and 1931 kind of vintage, right? For famously 14 months from bottom to top, top to bottom. And then a lot of assets that are probably post-war but pre-contemporary construction techniques, right? Where you can have floor to ceiling, beautiful glass windows and pre-LEED regime, right? So they made the decision, which turned out to be prescient, to renovate and retrofit all of their assets in order to attract a different type of tenant, a corporate tenant that really cared about sustainability as a core value, maybe more so than having space in a brand new building. Now, when they did all this work, they also upgraded the amenities and services unrelated to energy in these assets too, right? So the repositioning wasn't just around, but It was great marketing for them. They completely transformed the rent roll of a lot of their assets, got much higher quality from a credit perspective tenants, a lot bigger sort of Fortune 500 name tenants. And then local law 97 came along and they looked extraordinarily prescient because their assets were well positioned for local law 97. So I think a lot of the time it's driven by regulation or some existential need to reposition or a natural point to renovate the asset, right? If you have a building that has one or two tenants and they move out within 2 years of each other and you don't think you're competitive because you haven't renovated the building, of course you're going to renovate the building and you're going to make it more energy efficient. The last ground up project I worked on, it's called Winthrop at Millennium Partners, called Winthrop Center. It is the largest passive house office in the world. And so for those of you not familiar with passive house standards, very rigorous German system for recycling air and reducing energy, and their very stringent rules on what type of windows you can use and how you insulate them, et cetera, et cetera. We did that because it was more expensive to build passive house, and it really had only been explored in a residential context at scale before we did this project. But there were three motivations in that case. And you can, like, one, wanting to push the envelope, wanting to be good citizens and show that we care about not just sustainability, but wellness and tenant comfort. So the building also has LEED Platinum. But to your point, Brian, if you don't maintain that, these standards will degrade and become meaningless over time. Gold, right? So the idea of good air quality, good water quality, fitness, et cetera. But this was a public RFP process that the city of Boston, they own the land. So is the city of Boston going to be more likely to select a developer that wants to build a passive house or someone who isn't really taking the energy portion of the project as seriously, right? And then also, as it relates to leasing the office building, similar to the Empire State Building Trust example, tenants on the commercial side, it's fuzzy on the residential side, whether people care so much to pay a premium or preference a lease in a sustainable building. I can tell you on the corporate side, especially the ones that have spelled it out in their annual reports, they definitely do care about this stuff. And if you're competing in a market that's very challenging, like the office market has been post-COVID, it's not necessarily that you can charge a massive premium, but people will sign a lease with you and not necessarily the other Class A building down the street.
Fascinating.
And by the way, the sort of coda to this, as Local Law 97 it's interesting to look at the efficacy of it. That similar comparable laws have now been rolled out in tons of other large municipalities, right? So we're seeing increasing regulation driving owners, but it's ultimately about leasing, and it's about values. And I don't know a single developer who wants to use more energy in their buildings, right? It's just about, do you have the cash to do it? If you're a public REIT, you can tap the credit markets in a different way than if you're a private company who owns an asset, right? You need to usually come out of pocket for that. And if your building's empty because you want to renovate, you're not going to get financing on it. So in a lot of cases, your hands are tied when you can't tap the international low interest investment grade corporate credit market like a REIT can. So a lot of it depends on how you're structured and how well capitalized you are as an organization, irrespective of how much you care about this stuff.
From a provider standpoint, one of the challenges we often see and hear from the REITs, or especially like the regional owners, they're not necessarily large REITs, but maybe they own a dozen properties or 25 properties in a region. when you go to them with a pure energy efficiency play, which is really a big part of why I formed our opinion of we have to figure out what drives them. We can't go there thinking we know what drives them. Because if their tenant's paying all the energy, the desire, they might have a feel good desire to reduce energy of their building, but they don't actually have a financial incentive to do it. And I've even heard, and Zach, I'm curious your thoughts on this. I've heard that the way that they bill, especially if they're billing, if they're separating their bills and passing along with their common charges for CAM charges or whatever, that if we reduce overall energy efficiency, that's going to reduce their top line revenue, which is going to reduce their overall asset value. And so it ends up becoming almost a disincentive from a pure asset value for somebody who's not looking to do long-term hold, but more short-term, fix it up, get it leased out, and get it sold. And energy efficiency isn't necessarily part of that renovation work that they're doing. The renovation work they're doing is putting those tenant amenities in, which is why I typically run away from the comment of tenant experience, because that's maybe doing a short-term increase on your asset value, but not any long-term impact on your carbon efficiency, your energy efficiency, or your long-term human and comfort. Is that just more something that we see on a smaller basis just with smallers, or do we also see that kind of impact on the larger REITs making those kinds of decisions because the way that our business and our leases are structured right now are just not necessarily supportive and conducive to prioritizing energy efficiency?
Well, if you run triple net, you don't have a lot of incentive. So you didn't used to see it, for example, in industrial and warehousing. You didn't see any real regard for it from the owner perspective. I can't speak from the occupier perspective. I'm sure they cared about it because a lot of those were, if you're Amazon and you've made a climate pledge, right, and you're bleeding money on the energy at your warehouse, like you're going to care about it. What has gotten landlords to care about it, especially public REITs, is the mandatory Energy Star data disclosure. That's relatively new, which I'm not an expert on by any stretch of the imagination, but having to disclose that has really changed the game there. And we have a portfolio company called Enertiv that's been very active in that space. That was driven by regulation relative to reporting, not coming from municipal authority, but coming from the federal government effectively.
Right.
If the SEC says you need these disclosures now to be a publicly traded REIT, people are going to start caring about it. Ultimately, though, they don't have control. They have some influence, maybe, but if the tenant, as spelled out in that lease, is responsible for maintaining all of that equipment and responsible for paying that bill, I don't think investors should be penalizing folks necessarily in this particular case who have maybe score less well on that disclosure than their competition.
The one thing I wanted to comment on the passive house, we've got a project now, and we actually just met with the developer 2 weeks ago because their opinion was that because it was a passive house design and because it had all of this really good design embedded into the physical structure, that they really didn't need to invest in any technology and they could just leave it relatively dumb because the building itself was just going to sustain itself forever. And so it was really interesting in that conversation to educate them on how even a passive house design can over time become less efficient than designed if it's not well maintained and properly operated. The moral of the story is the education means that they're still going to put the technology in. They're still going to do it because they recognize that the design is fantastic. It allowed them to reduce the overall size of equipment, the amount of equipment they have to put into the space, but it's still equipment that has to be maintained and run properly. And I think there's a over eagerness sometimes to think that if we just design it, it will work and we can somehow reduce our OpEx even more than the design itself is going to do. But I think you really have to understand that it's both sides. It's the design and the physical structure and how you design things to run efficiently, but then it's also putting the right levers in place for operating these buildings properly. It's really both. You can't just decide you're going to do one or the other because at some point you'll leak.
There are plenty of people now building passive house, decent sized multifamily student housing kind of stuff, I would imagine they're not thinking that, oh, set it and forget it. It's passive house. Like, I bet the developers are deploying some sort of solution for those assets. Like, there's a passive house dorm on Roosevelt Island for Cornell Tech, which is a super cool building. And I doubt they have something super sophisticated in there like an office building would, but I would imagine they have.
That's the cool thing, is they don't have to be super sophisticated. And the other cool thing, and the part that we really haven't touched on yet, is the part that I'm excited about of what's coming for the 85% of the building stock that doesn't have anything intelligent, is the cost of technology and the advancements in wireless communication for these buildings is just ramping up like crazy. And we're starting to see that something that might have cost $180,000 2 years ago to re-automate or add automation to a building is now in the $80,000 range, full 50% reduction in cost. Most of that is in labor, but a lot of it is also in the hardware cost. And just the technology advancements that we've seen are finally starting to come into this world. I think the next decade will show a lot of improvement in that class of building. And they don't all have to be torn down. I know, Edward, that was one of your questions. Do we have to tear them all down? No. Zach's probably closer to this decision than I ever am. When you have to remediate so much stuff within a building that was built in the 40s, at what point does the carbon impact of tearing it down become less of a problem than dealing with that carbon impact and that embedded carbon and having a new structure that can sustain another 100 years? So I don't know how all of those decisions are made, but I know that when you're talking about carbon, that's a big part of that retrofit versus tear down kind of discussion.
So much to unpack there. First being the fact that the word passive should be removed from all real estate lingo. Passive income, passive. There's nothing passive about anything that's going on here. Also, I can't believe I've been to Boston downtown so many times and I haven't visited Zach's pièce de résistance, the Millennium Residences at Winthrop. But going back to Brian, what you said about just how much technology has advanced for the bottom 80% of buildings that the unit economics don't match the technology that we've had both on the connectivity side, the sensor side. What we had at ProCentry, my previous company, there's not only the advancement of battery technology, the fact that we can now have low powered sensors that last at least 10 to 15 years that cost dozens of dollars and not hundreds of thousands or thousands of dollars. And also not having to rely on stuff like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, but having protocols like LoRaWAN, long range wireless area networks. The convergence of these technologies really are making it so that Brian and OTI can work with buildings in a way that it's not cost prohibitive, but also matches the scale of the challenge.
Yeah, 100%. Because the OpEx budgets of, let's just say, a Class B building, or we could call it Class A, but in a suburb. So it wouldn't be considered Class A in downtown Manhattan, but out in a suburb, it's considered a Class A. Those buildings typically don't have the OpEx or the CapEx to invest heavily in automation. But with the stuff that's coming out now and the ability to censor areas that we haven't been able to censor very effectively, like with LoRaWAN's probably the leading technology that we're deploying right now from a wireless solution. Yeah, it just makes so many more opportunities approachable for these clients. And when we used to think that they didn't care, it wasn't that they didn't care, it was that they had signed off that it was not approachable for them because of just the state of their asset class. And now they're getting excited because now we're starting to get into a budget where they can actually put a 3-year plan together and completely change the paradigm of how they're automated and how much impact they can really have on their energy efficiency. So,
Totally. And to put it in simple terms, the huge benefit of LoRaWAN is that as opposed to Wi-Fi, where we would need one router every apartment or every few hundred feet to get signal, we can just rely on one router every 3 to 5 floors. which makes it by definition a lot more cost effective than Wi-Fi. Want to be respectful of your time, but I have to ask you about artificial intelligence. Where does AI actually create value in building operations today, if at all? And where do you see it going? Is it set point optimization, anomaly detection, predictive maintenance? Where do you see it?
Yeah, I think AI it's like the internet. So when the internet first came out, a few buildings were using it, and people thought it was stupid that we would ever think about things being on the internet. When we talk about AI and where it's going to be pervasive. It'll be a normal standard operating procedure within all of our lives, and that extends into our building operations and management. Today, we're doing set point optimization with AI for sure, but the big thing that the technology we were just talking about, LoRaWAN, the technology we're talking about that we've always had, there's a piece there that has to be done, and it's our digital infrastructure. So just because we've installed a bunch of systems, even in the Class A buildings, we haven't necessarily done it with applications that we hadn't foreseen in mind. So AI is bringing a whole host of applications and agents that are going to be available to us to use on a 24/7 basis. But because we didn't foresee that, we didn't prepare our digital infrastructure to actually just apply it universally. So Zach was talking about all those different manufacturers. They all have their own different ways of deploying their systems. Some are nefarious in order to keep you locked into them. Some are just ignorant of being normalized across technologies. Like they're not necessarily being bad. They just do things their way to make money their way. And even metering manufacturers, where you think a power meter should just be normalized. We should never call something KW, it's power. KW is the unit, but there's just so many things that we've done that way. And so in order for AI to really have the huge impact, you've got to have all of that normalized across the entire building stock. And so what we're really focused on is preparing, knowing that AI is going to have a big impact, knowing that agents are going to be universal. Even by the end of this year, I think we're going to see a lot more adoption of agents within the building stock. But you have to have that digital infrastructure ready so that it can just plug in. Because if there's a huge expense to apply AI to buildings, they're not going to do it. We just talked about the struggles on CapEx and OpEx for commercial real estate and all these different building classes. That's not going to go away. That pressure's not going away. So we're really focused on making sure that the infrastructure is ready, the data model and everything about that building is ready to have applications, whether they are analytics-based applications, whether they're set point adjustment applications, whether they're just pure reporting or even just deep mining to look for anomaly detection. You have to have that data ready. And I think that's the biggest thing we can be spending our time on right now is getting prepared for those applications. The thing I love about AI is that we don't really know everything it's going to be able to do. But what we do know is that the more we do to prepare for that eventuality, the easier it is going to be to deploy it and actually see the real savings, the real optimizations we can get, the human savings.
Last but not least, collaboration superpower. If you could choose one person, historic or living, to do a partnership with, who would it be?
Oh, there's an amazing question. It would probably be somebody, I don't know, one of these geniuses that just saw stuff that nobody else could see. Whether you're talking about Einstein and all the theories that he had in his head, or even you go back hundreds and hundreds of years to people who were understanding the universe and how it worked and how it functioned when people didn't even understand what a star was. I think those are the kind of people that really think outside of their current experience, because those are the people that really change things for the good. And I think that the more we can step outside of our own world, outside of our own little day-to-day struggle, and really figure out the impact that big ideas can have, I think the better off we'll all be. So I didn't give you a real name, but I just think philosophically, there's probably hundreds of people we can think about. It's amazing to be around those kinds of people that are just thinking so far ahead of where everything else is. And I'm also constantly blown away, Edward, by just movies and shows and how go back 40 and 50 years ago, when movies were made, and we're starting to see real stuff that they were predicting in these movies, like even something as silly as Star Trek, and how the hologram rooms and all of these different areas that they were making up inside those things that we thought never would be happening. But yet here, a lot of that's a reality. Or even to walk up, and I know this isn't happening at scale yet, but walk up to a thing and tell it to make you a steak dinner and put you in St. Mark's Plaza in 1500. I don't see that being very far from being a reality. And when you look at today's science fiction or any of the today's shows that are projecting what 20, 30, 40 years might look like, it's impressive. And I tend to think that those sorts of things are happening. And so then it's a matter of, okay, now what do we do right now to best prepare ourselves for that reality? Because it's coming.
So true when it comes to just TVs and movies and humans' imagination. And they certainly predict a lot of stuff or manifest it into inspiring actual scientists in the next generation. But in the spirit of answering the question and helping you translate that into a name, I Googled genius that saw stuff that nobody could see. And one of the first names that comes up is this fella, Claude Shannon, which now I'm wondering if Anthropic named their model Claude after him, because Claude Shannon was an American polymath who is known as the father of information theory, who, among other things, mapped the digital age. So
Fascinating.
We're going to go with Claude Shannon.
I like it.
Brian, where can Tangent listeners and owners and operators of buildings and engineers learn more about OTI and connect with you?
Connect with me on LinkedIn, Brian Turner. OTI.net is our website. We've got some exciting things coming out in the next few months as we continue to innovate. We've got some great partners that are working with us on really defining what that roadmap can look like for the next generation building, and not just from a physical structure, but from that digital infrastructure as well. There's a lot of great things going on out here. So exciting time to be part of this business.
Brian Turner, thank you so much for coming to Tangent today and sharing your wisdom, your experience, and your vision with us.
Thank you, Edward. It was amazing to be on Tangent.
Muchas gracias, and thank you for listening to this episode of Tangent Proptech. If you learned something new or enjoyed the conversation, text a friend the link to this episode right now. You can find links, resources, and ways to connect with us in the show notes, or reach out anytime at tangentcommunity@gmail.com. We love interview suggestions, topic ideas, or just a friendly hello. If you're building something impactful in real estate or tech and want to reach our audience of decision makers, investors, and operators, email us. That's tangentcommunity@gmail.com.